Oklahoma is not typically portrayed as a battleground in America's modern gang wars. Its cities lack the global reputation of Los Angeles, Chicago, or New York, and its prison system rarely dominates national headlines. Yet beneath the surface, a violent and highly organized criminal conflict has unfolded, one not driven by street-level chaos, but by disciplined command structures, racial ideology, and orders issued from behind concrete walls. By mid-2019, this conflict would harden into what law enforcement would later describe as a full-scale gang war between the Universal Aryan Brotherhood and various blood gang sets operating across the state. To understand how Oklahoma became a flashpoint, one must first understand the gangs themselves. The Universal Aryan Brotherhood, known as the UAB, is not a loose association of extremists, but a structured, white supremacist criminal enterprise with deep roots inside the prison system. While outwardly framed around racial identity, its true engine is profit, drug trafficking, weapons distribution, and the enforcement of criminal discipline through fear. Leadership within the UAB is hierarchical, insulated, and often incarcerated, with orders flowing outward to free world associates who act as enforcers, couriers, and assassins. Opposing them are blood gang sets that migrated into Oklahoma over time, adapting to local conditions while maintaining national affiliations and identity. Like the UAB, these blood sets operate as organized criminal networks rather than spontaneous street crews. Their survival depends on control of neighborhoods, drug corridors, and influence within correctional facilities. Methamphetamine, fentanyl, and other narcotics form the backbone of their operations, generating revenue that fuels expansion and retaliation alike. By the late 2000s, Oklahoma had quietly become fertile ground for both groups. Its location made it a crossroads for drug distribution, while its prison system served as a central organizing hub. Inmates moved between facilities, carrying alliances and grudges with them. Contraband cell phones bridged the gap between incarceration and the outside world, allowing imprisoned leaders to direct operations with alarming precision. The walls meant to contain violence instead became command centers for it. The first sparks of open conflict appeared around mid-2019. Intelligence gathered later by law enforcement revealed escalating confrontations between UAB members and blood gang affiliates, both on the streets and inside correctional institutions. What began as competition over drug territory quickly evolved into something more personal and ideological. Each side viewed the other not merely as a rival, but as an existential threat, one that needed to be made an example of. Inside prisons, tensions manifested through assaults, intimidation, and strategic alliances. Outside, they took the form of kidnappings, ambushes, and targeted killings. Violence was no longer random. It was deliberate, symbolic, and intended to send messages. Acts of brutality served dual purposes, eliminating rivals and reinforcing loyalty within the ranks. In this world, fear was currency, and reputation was survival. Law enforcement agencies at first struggled to connect the dots. Individual crimes appeared isolated, drug deals gone wrong, personal disputes, unexplained disappearances. But as cases accumulated, patterns emerged. Victims were often affiliated with one gang or another. The methods bore similarities. And increasingly, investigators noticed that key decisions seemed to originate from individuals already serving lengthy prison sentences. This was not a street war fueled by impulse. It was a coordinated campaign, managed by incarcerated leaders who had learned to weaponize the prison system itself. The Universal Aryan Brotherhood, in particular, demonstrated a capacity for long-term planning. Violence was authorized, not spontaneous. Targets were selected based on loyalty, affiliation, and symbolic value. And retaliation was calculated to escalate, not merely respond. By late 2019, the conflict had crossed the threshold. It was no longer a series of skirmishes. It was a war being fought on two fronts. Inmates carried out stabbings and assaults behind bars, while associates on the outside executed kidnappings and murders in parking lots, motel rooms, and quiet residential areas. Oklahoma's criminal underworld had entered a new phase, one defined by coordination, brutality, and an almost complete disregard for public visibility. What neither side fully anticipated was how closely they were being watched. As the body count rose and violence intensified, federal and state authorities began assembling a broader picture. Surveillance, wiretaps, informants, and prison intelligence units started mapping the structure of the UAB and tracking its communications. Each act of violence intended to assert dominance instead left another thread for investigators to pull. Still, for the gangs themselves, escalation seemed inevitable. In their worldview, restraint signaled weakness, reputation demanded action, and as the rivalry deepened, it set the stage for an event that would shock even seasoned investigators, a murder so calculated and symbolic that it would expose the inner workings of the war to the public for the first time. That moment would come in November 2021 with the killing of a young man named Konner Huckeby. And when it did, the war between the Universal Aryan Brotherhood and the blood gangs would no longer be hidden in the shadows. It would be impossible to ignore. By the time Oklahoma entered 2020, the conflict between the Universal Aryan Brotherhood and blood gang sets had moved beyond rivalry and into something far more structured and dangerous. What made this war different from countless other gang disputes was not just the level of violence, but the sophistication behind it. This was not chaos spilling into the streets, it was coordination. And at the center of it all was a system that allowed men already serving prison sentences to function as commanders in an ongoing criminal campaign. Inside Oklahoma's correctional facilities, the tension was constant and unmistakable. Housing units were divided along racial and gang lines, with alliances dictated not by convenience but by survival. The Universal Aryan Brotherhood operated as a disciplined collective, enforcing obedience through strict internal rules and brutal punishment. Loyalty was non-negotiable. Orders were followed without debate. Any perceived weakness, hesitation, cooperation with authorities, or unauthorized contact with rivals was met with violence. Across the aisle, blood-affiliated inmates organized in their own clusters, maintaining identity, symbols, and allegiance even while incarcerated. Though fragmented into sets, they shared common enemies and common interests, particularly when it came to narcotics trafficking. Prison was not a pause in operations. It was a reorganization hub. Connections were forged, debts were tracked, and conflicts that began on the street were carried inside with deadly consequences. Contraband cell phones changed everything. Smuggled into facilities through corrupted staff, visitors, or hidden compartments, these devices erased the barrier between prison and the outside world. With a phone in hand, incarcerated gang leaders could issue instructions, approve drug shipments, coordinate retaliation, and monitor loyalty in real time. Conversations that once took weeks through intermediaries now happened instantly, often encrypted and far beyond the reach of casual surveillance. Law enforcement would later determine that the Universal Aryan Brotherhood had mastered this system. High-ranking members, already serving lengthy sentences, were effectively insulated from immediate consequences. They rarely touched drugs or weapons themselves. Instead, they delegated responsibility outward to trusted associates who operated in cities rural towns and highway corridors across Oklahoma. These free world members handled distribution, enforcement, and violence, while prison leaders collected profits and maintained control. The blood gangs operated similarly, though with less centralized command. Set leaders communicated with incarcerated shot callers, relaying instructions and intelligence. This decentralized structure made them adaptable, but also vulnerable. Unlike the UAB's rigid hierarchy, blood sets sometimes acted independently, leading to miscalculations that escalated tensions further. A single unauthorized move could provoke a response far beyond what was anticipated. As 2020 unfolded, the violence intensified on both fronts. Inside prisons, assaults became more targeted. Inmates were attacked in showers, recreation yards, and cells, often using improvised weapons. These were not spontaneous fights. They were deliberate acts meant to enforce dominance and send warnings. A stabbing inside could trigger retaliation on the streets within days or hours. Outside prison walls, the war played out in quieter but equally brutal ways. Drug deals were used as traps. Meetings were arranged under false pretenses. Victims were isolated, abducted, and interrogated before being assaulted or killed. The goal was not just elimination, but humiliation. Forced confessions, denouncements of gang affiliation, and recorded statements became tools of psychological warfare. Territory was another flashpoint. Methamphetamine distribution routes crisscrossed Oklahoma, linking suppliers to local dealers and prison contacts. Control of these routes meant money, leverage, and influence. When one side encroached on another's territory, violence followed. Entire neighborhoods became contested ground, with residents often unaware that seemingly random crimes were part of a much larger struggle. For law enforcement, the challenge was immense. Crimes occurred across jurisdictions, involving multiple agencies with limited information sharing. Witnesses were terrified. Victims rarely cooperated. And the individuals giving orders were often already behind bars, shielded by layers of intermediaries. Traditional policing methods struggled to keep pace with an enemy that operated both inside maximum security facilities and in the free world simultaneously. Yet patterns were forming. Investigators began noticing recurring names, phone numbers, and locations. Prison intelligence units flagged suspicious inmate communications. Financial records revealed money flowing from street-level dealers into accounts linked to incarcerated individuals. Slowly, a picture emerged, one of a criminal enterprise that treated incarceration not as an obstacle, but as a strategic advantage. By late 2020, the war had reached a dangerous equilibrium. Both sides understood the stakes. Neither was willing to back down. Retaliation was expected, even demanded. Violence had become normalized, almost routine. But beneath the surface, something was building, an act so calculated and so symbolic that it would rupture the fragile balance and bring unprecedented attention to the conflict. That act would not take place inside a prison yard or during a drug deal gone wrong. It would be staged carefully, executed publicly, and designed to send a message far beyond Oklahoma's gang underworld. And in November 2021, that message would be delivered through the life and death of Connor Huckeby. By the fall of 2021, the war between the Universal Aryan Brotherhood and blood gang sets had settled into a grim rhythm. Violence was expected. Retaliation was routine. For those involved, brutality had become normalized, stripped of shock or hesitation. But even within this hardened landscape, there were lines that, when crossed, changed everything. The kidnapping and murder of Connor Huckeby would become one of those moments, a crime so deliberate, so symbolic, that it exposed the inner mechanics of the war to the outside world. Connor Huckeby was known to investigators as an alleged blood gang associate, someone believed to be connected, directly or indirectly, to the broader network involved in Oklahoma's drug trade. To the Universal Aryan Brotherhood, he was not just an individual. He was a symbol. In the logic of gang warfare, symbols carry weight far beyond their personal actions. Eliminating one could send a message to many. The plan, according to later court records, was calculated from the beginning. Huckeby was not targeted in a spontaneous encounter or random act of violence. He was lured. UAB associates allegedly contacted him under the guise of a fentanyl drug deal, one of the most common currencies in the criminal underworld. The meeting place was chosen deliberately. A hotel, neutral ground that offered privacy, plausible deniability, and easy access for both surveillance and escape. When Huckeby arrived, he walked into a trap. What followed was not immediate violence, but control. He was kidnapped and taken to a hotel parking lot, where the assault began. Beatings were not simply about inflicting pain, they were about dominance. Witness accounts and investigative findings later described how Huckeby was forced to submit, stripped of agency in a way designed to break him psychologically before his life was taken. At some point during the ordeal, Huckeby was allegedly compelled to humiliate himself and verbally denounce the blood gang. This moment was critical. In gang culture, public renunciation under duress is one of the ultimate forms of degradation. It sends a message, not just to the victim, but to every member watching from the shadows. Loyalty can be broken, identity can be erased, and defiance will be punished absolutely. Only after this symbolic act was completed did the violence escalate to its final stage. Huckeby was stabbed and shot. Multiple methods used not out of necessity, but intent. The brutality was deliberate, ensuring death while reinforcing the message behind it. This was not a killing meant to be hidden. It was meant to be known. When Huckabee's body was discovered, the shock rippled outward. For local communities, it was another tragic act of violence. For law enforcement, it was something far more revealing. The method, the staging, and the circumstances immediately suggested gang involvement at a high level. This was not a personal dispute or drug deal gone wrong. It bore the unmistakable signature of organized, premeditated retaliation. As investigators began peeling back the layers, a disturbing possibility emerged. The orders may not have come from the streets at all. Evidence pointed toward coordination originating inside Oklahoma's prison system. High-ranking Universal Aryan Brotherhood leaders, men already incarcerated, were allegedly directing violence beyond the prison walls. Names began to surface, including Kyle Morris and Rusty Williams, identified by prosecutors as influential figures within the UAB hierarchy. According to allegations, they used contraband cell phones to communicate with Free World associates, authorizing the kidnapping and murder from behind bars. If true, it meant that the walls of the prison had not contained the war. They had become its headquarters. The Huckeby murder marked a turning point for investigators. Surveillance intensified. Phone records were scrutinized. Informants were pressured and protected. What had once appeared as scattered incidents now began to align into a coherent narrative of command and control. The killing was no longer viewed as an isolated act, but as part of a broader campaign designed to intimidate blood gang members and consolidate UAB dominance. Within the gang world, the message landed exactly as intended. Fear spread. Rumors circulated. Retaliation was discussed, but caution prevailed. The sheer brutality of the act and the suggestion that it had been ordered by powerful figures already serving time, sent a chilling signal. This was a reminder that incarceration did not mean safety from reprisal, and that prison leadership could still reach far beyond the fences. For the Universal Aryan Brotherhood, the murder was meant to solidify power. Instead, it drew unprecedented attention. The killing of Connor Huckeby would become the flashpoint that transformed a largely hidden gang war into a high-profile criminal investigation. It forced authorities to confront a sobering reality. Oklahoma was facing a new kind of organized violence, one orchestrated from prison cells, executed on the streets, and enforced through terror. And as investigators dug deeper, they would uncover a network far more expansive, violent, and entrenched than anyone had initially imagined. That discovery would define the next phase of the war and trigger a response that would ultimately bring the state and federal government crashing down on the Universal Aryan Brotherhood. In the aftermath of Connor Huckabe's murder, investigators were no longer asking if the violence was being coordinated from prison, but how far that coordination extended. What began as a street-level homicide investigation quickly evolved into a sweeping inquiry into the inner workings of the Universal Aryan Brotherhood, exposing a system in which incarceration functioned not as an endpoint, but as a command post. At the center of the allegations were high-ranking UAB leaders, already serving sentences in Oklahoma state prisons. These men were not isolated figures fading into irrelevance. They were deeply embedded in the gang's hierarchy, insulated by loyalty, fear, and layers of intermediaries. Prison, in many ways, offered them stability, regular communication with fellow members, protection through alliances, and a captive environment in which discipline could be enforced with ruthless efficiency. Contraband cell phones were the lifeline of this system. Smuggled into facilities despite security measures, the phones allowed incarcerated leaders to communicate directly with free world associates. Calls and messages could be made at any hour, instructions delivered instantly, and updates received in real time. For law enforcement, this represented one of the most dangerous evolutions in modern gang activity: the collapse of the barrier between prison and the street. According to prosecutors, figures such as Kyle Morris and Rusty Williams function as strategic decision-makers within the UAB. From inside their cells, they allegedly authorized acts of violence, resolved internal disputes, and managed the gang's drug trafficking operations. They did not need to be present at crime scenes. Their power came from reputation, authority, and the knowledge that disobedience would be met with swift and brutal consequences. Violence in this structure was not impulsive, it was policy. When an individual was targeted, the decision followed an internal logic. Was the person a rival, a perceived informant, a member who had violated gang rules, or, as in the Huckabee case, a symbolic enemy whose death would reinforce dominance? Once a decision was made, the execution was delegated to trusted free world members, often younger associates, eager to prove loyalty and earn status within the organization. The Universal Aryan Brotherhood's use of extreme violence went beyond what was necessary to eliminate threats. Investigators documented patterns of brutality designed to intimidate entire networks, in some cases involving the UAB and other rival groups, including the Irish mob. Violence escalated to beheadings and dismemberment, acts meant to instill fear and demonstrate absolute control. These methods reinforced the gang's reputation as one of the most dangerous and uncompromising criminal organizations operating in Oklahoma. Inside prison walls, the effects were immediate. UAB members enforced discipline through assaults and intimidation, ensuring silence and compliance. Information flowed upward. Money flowed inward. Drugs were trafficked, not just as commodities, but as instruments of power, rewarding loyalty and punishing dissent. Inmates understood that refusing orders or cooperating with authorities did not simply endanger them. It endangered their families and associates outside. For the blood gangs, the realization that their rivals were being directed from within prison added a new layer of threat. Retaliation became more complex. Targeting street-level UAB members did little to disrupt leadership. Meanwhile, prison-based blood affiliates faced increased pressure, assaults, and strategic isolation. The war had become asymmetrical, with one side wielding a more centralized and insulated command structure. As evidence mounted, law enforcement adapted. Investigators began focusing less on individual crimes and more on conspiracy. Wiretaps, monitored prison calls, financial records, and informant testimony were combined to map the UAB's hierarchy. Each intercepted message, each seized phone, provided another glimpse into how deeply embedded the organization was, within both the prison system and the broader criminal landscape. The Huckeby murder, prosecutors would argue, was not an anomaly. It was an example, an illustration of how far the Universal Aryan Brotherhood was willing to go to assert control and how effectively it could project violence beyond prison walls. The case became a keystone, linking disparate acts of violence to a single, organized command. By the end of 2021 and into 2022, the walls were closing in. What had once been whispers among inmates and rumors on the street were now formal allegations in court filings. The state and federal governments were no longer chasing individual offenders. They were preparing to dismantle an enterprise. And as the pressure increased, the Universal Aryan Brotherhood faced a reality it had long avoided. Every order leaves a trail. Every act of violence, no matter how carefully orchestrated, creates witnesses, evidence, and consequences. The war had reached a new phase, not one fought with knives and guns, but with indictments, testimony, and decades-long sentences waiting at the end. The reckoning was coming. By 2022, the war between the Universal Aryan Brotherhood and blood gang sets had entered its most decisive phase. What had begun as a violent struggle for control of territory and influence was now overshadowed by a far more formidable opponent: the combined weight of state and federal law enforcement. The Huckeby murder, along with a growing catalog of coordinated crimes, had provided authorities with the leverage they needed to move beyond reactive policing and toward systematic dismantling. Investigators no longer viewed the Universal Aryan Brotherhood as a collection of violent offenders. They treated it as what it was: an organized criminal enterprise operating across prison walls, county lines, and federal jurisdictions. This shift in perspective changed everything. Rather than focusing on individual assaults or drug seizures, prosecutors began building conspiracy cases that tied leadership decisions to street-level violence. Federal agencies joined forces with Oklahoma state authorities, pooling intelligence gathered over years. Prison intelligence units tracked inmate communications. Financial investigators followed money trails linking drug sales to incarcerated leaders. Informants, many of them facing long sentences themselves, began to cooperate, offering insight into the UAB's internal hierarchy and decision-making processes. Each piece of information added another brick to an increasingly solid case. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from the analysis of contraband cell phone use. Seized devices revealed communication patterns that directly contradicted the notion that incarcerated individuals were removed from criminal activity. Messages and call logs demonstrated how orders flowed from prison cells to free world enforcers. These communications helped prosecutors establish intent, authority, and coordination, key elements in proving racketeering and conspiracy charges. At the same time, law enforcement targeted the financial backbone of the organization. Drug trafficking networks directed by the UAB were disrupted through coordinated raids, seizures, and arrests. Methamphetamine distribution routes were dismantled, and firearms linked to gang violence were recovered. Each arrest not only removed an operative from the streets, but also weakened the gang's ability to function cohesively. The scope of the investigation expanded rapidly. What initially appeared to involve a handful of individuals soon revealed a network of dozens. Over time, more than 60 convictions would be tied to UAB-directed drug trafficking operations alone. These cases spanned years and jurisdictions, reflecting the depth and reach of the organization's influence throughout Oklahoma. For the blood gangs, the intensified law enforcement presence altered the landscape. Increased surveillance and prosecutions disrupted their operations as well, even as the primary focus remained on the UAB's centralized leadership. The war that had once been fought in shadows was now unfolding under court lights, with evidence laid bare and alliances exposed. Courtrooms became the new battlegrounds. Testimony detailed the inner workings of the Universal Aryan Brotherhood, how loyalty was enforced, how violence was sanctioned, and how prison leadership maintained control. Prosecutors painted a picture of an organization that had exploited systemic weaknesses in the prison system to extend its reach into every corner of the state. By 2023 and 2024, convictions began to stack up. Sentences were severe, reflecting the gravity of the crimes and the organized nature of the enterprise. Judges emphasized deterrence, acknowledging that the violence orchestrated by the UAB had endangered not only rival gang members, but the public at large.